Jung's Analytical Psychology, Introduction, Part 1. Personality Psychology, Dr. Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. Carl Gustav Jung was born in a small Swiss town and lived most of his life in Zurich. As opposed to Freud, he was brought up Christian and he had ministers in his family. Early on, he desired to be a classical philosopher. However, that just didn't work out for him. He ended up having to care for his mother and his sister and decided to choose a practical career, medicine, and eventually psychiatry. He was early on strongly influenced by Freud. After the publication of The Interpretation of Dreams, Jung was extremely fascinated with Freud's work, and wrote him a fan letter. Now, he wrote a fan letter, received a response. That was very nice, and the response basically said to the effect, "You're ever in Vienna, drop by and we'll have a chat." Well, distances in Europe are a lot smaller than they are across the United States, and Jung found an excuse to go to Vienna. And he went to Vienna. Freud invited him for dinner. They went and had a chat before dinner, ate dinner, and then proceeded back to Freud's study, where they spent the rest of the night into the next morning talking theory. It was just a simpatico meeting of the minds. And Freud eventually dubbed Jung his crown prince, and Jung was supposed to take the mantle of psychoanalysis after Freud passed and keep the flame going. There was only one problem with this. Well, there were several problems, but here's the biggest one. To use someone's theory against him, Freud was extremely anal about his theory. Probably a little narcissistic too, but I'm not a clinician, so I shouldn't be judging these things. And what Jung found out is that he would talk to Freud about some new idea he had, and that was really exciting. And Freud would kind of be dismissive and kind of tell Jung that, well, when I'm gone, your job is to maintain what I created in psychoanalysis, but you're not to add to it. I got it right. Freud, not me. Well, you can imagine that doesn't go over good with a creative thinker like Jung. And the rift got deeper and deeper and deeper until it broke, and they had a major split. After the split, the two never talked to each other for the rest of their lives. Even if they were at the same meeting, they just passed by with their little entourages and didn't interact. Now, if you look at most textbooks, you see that the major split is usually attributed to two characteristics of Freud's theory: the reliance on psychopathology and the development of Freud's ideas, and, according to history and historians, the overemphasis on sex in Freud's theory. Now, Jung was not nearly dismissive of sexuality and the importance of sex at all, and he was a psychoanalyst and interested in psychopathology. But Jung's theory, as you will find, far more expansive, looks at a lot of sociocultural things, looks at some metaphysical things, very, very different than Freud's. So, all in all, my personal view is the split is primarily based not just on sex and psychopathology, but a fundamental way of seeing the world. Jung sees the world as something moving towards what he called self-realization. Self-realization is the idea that Abraham Maslow took and turned into self-actualization. Jung was the first one really to talk about it. But I see Jung and Freud as being kind of opposites. Freud being dark, deep. You have all the seething stuff going around in the unconscious about sex and pathology and all that good stuff. Not that it's totally missing from Jung, but you also have a nature that humans are moving towards a grander global good, and in turn we're molded by, and this is another big break with Freud's idea, not only our past in terms of our development, which Jung did think was very important as well, but our pre-ancestry. That we are the result of evolutionary processes that have predisposed us, and I'll talk a great deal about predispositions in this set of lectures, to behave in certain ways. And these predispositions have been shaped by our past as humans and our human ancestors, as well as our pre-human ancestors, going all the way back to the first couple of single-celled organisms floating around in the primordial slime. So, Jung's going to be different than Freud. You're not going to get a comprehensive look at Jung. I can't do that in the little time we have for him. To me, learning about Jung is like falling into a pretty big pool of water and just sinking and sinking and sinking and sinking. And you get more knowledge the deeper you go. But it's hard to get there. So we'll get an appreciation for it, but we won't quite get there. I want to devote the rest of the short video lecture to Jung's definition of personality. And you're going to see how radically different it is from Freud's view of the world. Now I'm going to start by reading it, and then I'm going to go through by highlighting what I think are some important components of it. So let's take a look at Jung's definition of personality. Okay. Jung says personality is the supreme realization of the innate idiosyncrasy of a living being. It is an act of courage flung in the face of life, the absolute affirmation of all that constitutes the individual, the most successful adaptation to the universal conditions of existence, coupled with the greatest possible freedom for self-determination. You almost want to run it up on a flagpole and make it part of the constitution of a country. I just kind of get all excited every time I read it. It's like, should be the preamble to some constitution for a country someplace, as I said. To me, it's a bit awe-inspiring. Let's take it apart. The supreme realization. I really agree with Jung. Personality is the most important part of a person. Yes, all the other subfields of psychology can talk about what they do and what their work does to understand an individual. But when you put it all together, you got personality. So I agree with the supreme realization part. It is the innate idiosyncrasy of an individual being. Now I'm going to take a little latitude and say that we're all individual, we're all idiosyncratic. So even though we can talk about universally what it's like to be a human being, we can also talk about our own individuality here. Act of courage flung in the face of life. I have no idea how that's science, but it sounds pretty damn good, doesn't it? The absolute affirmation for all that constitutes the individual. Your personality processes basically are you. And where do they come from? The successful adaptation of the universal conditions of existence. Easy for me to say. In other words, they've evolved. We're predisposed, hardwired to do and think lots of things in Jung's view. And kind of like the Greeks, coupled with the greatest possible freedom for self-determination. In other words, our personality gives us a set of tools we can go out and do wonderful and great things with it. Flowery stuff. Not a really great operational scientific definition like Gordon Allport, one of my other heroes. You heard his definition in the first unit. But I think it's pretty good. Let's look at some basic tenets of Jungian theory. Now, Jung was very fascinated with Eastern mysticism. The yin, yang, all that kind of great stuff. So when you look at Jung's work and you look at a lot of the individuals who follow Jung from a scholarly perspective, they use a lot of symbolism. They use a lot of mandalas. So you will find this lecture scattered with different mandalas. I have no idea what any of them mean, but they had a nice little graphic to the slides. So back to these basic ideas about Jung. Jung says the roots of our personality is archaic and primitive. As I said, they go beyond our existence right now, and the roots of our personalities go back to the beginning of life on this planet. So you have the human ancestry, the pre-human ancestry, the mammalian ancestry, as I said before, all the way back to the single-cell organisms floating around in the primordial slime where life began here. Jung says a lot of our personality is hardwired because of those evolutionary consequences. And we're hardwired, it's innate, we automatically do lots of stuff. We automatically think and feel things. And one of the more interesting parts of this presentation will be telling you why that's the case. Jung is unconscious. Well, he isn't unconscious. Well, he's dead now, so that's pretty unconscious. Sorry about that. But Jung's notion is that much of what goes on is unconscious. We're not aware of how things affect us. And then finally, Jung says that there is a large component of personality that is universal. A lot of these structural components. They exist in all humans in all places. This is one of the reasons that as we go through, you'll find Jung in his lifetime was fascinated with symbols, with mythology, and he was just awed with how you could look at different cultures across the entire planet and find that a lot of the myths were shared. And if they weren't a shared myth, we could understand the myths of other cultures because they're based on these archaic, primal, hardwired things. Jung's theory is a bit more scientific than Freud, but it lacks a lot of scientific credibility. As an evolutionary psychologist, I find a lot of things matching between Jung's theory and modern evolutionary theory. I think Jung would have really jumped on the evolutionary psychology bandwagon. I think he would have been fascinated by it, and it would have fit very much into lots of his ideas. So maybe that's why I'm so fascinated with this theory. And I hope to give you an appreciation for it over the next few video lectures. See you next time. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.